I'm going to recommend a few short story collections, and I thought one video should address one book because I can talk about it in more depth. And here we have Nabokov's dozen, but there are 13 stories in Nabokov's dozen. And three stories here stand out for me: The Spring in Fialda, Signs and Symbols, and That in Aleppo Once. I've read all three of these stories more than once, more than twice, and with Signs and Symbols, I think it's the most famous Nabokov story. Is most highly regarded. I think with Signs and Symbols, the mental state of the boy, when you read it for the first time, his predicament stands out so much that it overtakes the whole color of the story in the first reading, and by the second and third reading you sort of understand its implications for his parents and how how the story is sort of beating around the bush of his condition so as to give us this landscape of the whole thing. And with each reading, so it gets more softer, it gets less technical. That's the good thing about Signs and Symbols, where apart from, of course, its clinical style. Spring in Fialda is different because in the first reading, this method of contrasting the first and second reading, I guess, is a novel form of reviewing. But in the first reading, Spring in Fialda reads like this story of love lost, of the things that could not be. And because the sensory input is so overwhelming, you sort of get lost in that. You get lost in the beauty of the prose, the turn of the sentences. But by the second reading and by the third reading, you understand the sort of unreliable character of the narrator, which is, I guess it's naive to say Nabokov would not be using this in such a time-addled story, a story that moves back and forth so many times and gives so many opportunities for that unreliable narrator to come out. But the narrator is rather unreliable in Spring in Fialda, and there is sort of this grading between the character of Ferdinand and the character of the narrator. And this is the things I've said until now are for people who have already read the story, and for people who have not read the story but have read other Nabokovs. It's that Spring in Fialda is one of those stories that sort of tries to approximate a novel, in the sense that because it's almost 22 pages, Nabokov can bring back themes, he can bring back images and sort of form that mosaic that holds the story together, as he does in his novels and not in all of his short stories, because they're very short. So in Signs and Symbols, things do not come back very much. The basket and the things in the basket come back in the end of the story, so to form this picture. Nabokov will always do that. He will always create patterns, but in Spring in Fialda, the pattern is much more novelistic, so to say. Now there is that final story that I want to talk about, That in Aleppo Once. I think it is one of the funniest things ever written by Nabokov, and it is also one of the saddest things ever written by Nabokov. The images of the initial images of this bureaucratic frenzy are very Kafkaesque, but there is of course nothing in it that resembles Kafka's monotonous drone. It is inventive in wilder ways, but it's not proper to say that the narrator in Aleppo Once is unreliable, because it is so obviously unreliable that it's not worth mentioning. But what comes out is this madman's way of finding love and betrayal in his imagination. It works very well. And I think I should like to read one passage each from all three of the stories to make my point. So I'll start with the last thing I just talked about, That in Aleppo Once. So this in this passage is the whole story he's writing to a friend. It's in epistolic form. So let us look at this passage. He's talking about this woman. It was love at first touch rather than at first sight, for I had met her several times before without experiencing any special emotions. But one night, as I was seeing her home, something quaint she had said made me stoop with a laugh and lightly kiss her on the hair. And of course, we all know of that blinding blast which is caused by merely picking up a small doll from the floor of a carefully abandoned house. The soldier involved hears nothing. For him, it is but an ecstatic, soundless, and boundless expansion of what had been during his life a pinpoint of light in the dark center of his being. And the reason we think of death in celestial terms is that the visible firmament, especially at night, above our blacked out Paris, with the gaunt arches of its boulevard excelments and the ceaseless alpine gurgle of desolate latrines, is the most adequate and ever present symbol of that vast silent explosion. But I cannot discern her. She remains as nebulous as my best poem, and the one you made such gruesome fun of in the literature Zapishki. When I want to imagine her, I have to cling mentally to a tiny brown birthmark on her downy forearm, as one concentrates upon a punctuation mark in an illegible sentence. Perhaps, had she used a greater amount of makeup or used it more constantly, I might have visualized her face today, or at least the delicate transverse furrows of dry, hot rouged lips. But I fail. Although I still feel their elusive touch now and then in the blind man's buff of my senses, in that sobbing sort of dream when she and I clumsily clutch at each other through a heartbreaking mist, and I cannot see the color of her eyes for the blank luster of brimming tears drowning their irises. So this tenderness for this sort of non-existent love is, is contrasted with his contempt with his own impotence. That's Aleppo. I think I've read the tender part and not the funny part, but you'll find it when you read it. And for signs and symbols, I would like to read, I think, the most quoted passages of passage of Nabokov's short stories, but I cannot read the whole thing with the mother and father. That is the longer part of the story, so I'll just read this passage. The system of his is the little child who is in the sanatorium. The system of his delusions had been the subject of an elaborate paper in a scientific monthly. But long before that, she and her husband had puzzled it out for themselves. Referential mania, Hermann Brink had called it. In these very rare cases, the patient imagines that everything happening around him is a veiled reference to his personality and existence. He excludes real people from the conspiracy, and because he considers himself to be so much more intelligent than other men. Phenomenal nature shadows him wherever he goes. Clouds in the staring sky transmit to one another by means of slow signs incredibly detailed information regarding him. His inmost thoughts are discussed at nightfall in manual alphabet by darkly gesticulating trees. Pebbles or stains or sunflakes form patterns representing in some awful way messages which he must intercept. Everything is a cipher, and of everything he is the theme. Some of the spies are detached observers, such as glass surfaces and still pools. Others, such as coats in store windows, are prejudiced witnesses, lynchers at heart. Others again, running water, storms, are hysterical to the point of insanity, have a distorted opinion of him, and grotesquely misinterpret his actions. He must always be on his guard and devote every minute and module of life to the decoding of the undulation of things. The very air he exhales is indexed and filed away. Let me repeat that. The very air he exhales is indexed and filed away. If the only interest he provokes were limited to his immediate surroundings, but alas, it is not. With distance, the torrents of wild scandal increase in volume and volubility. The silhouettes of his blood corpuscles, magnified 1,000,000 times, flit over vast plains, and still farther, great mountains of unbearable solidity and height sum up in terms of granite and groaning firs the ultimate truth of his being. And now for the passage from Spring in Field, I have moved my phone for a better light, for a better spring light. Nina wistfully alluded to lunch, and seizing the opportunity when Ferdinand and Sergio stopped at a post office, I hastened to lead her away. I still wonder what exactly she meant to me, that small dark woman of the narrow shoulders and lyrical limbs, to quote the expression of a mincing emigre poet, one of the few men who had sighed platonically after her. And still less do I understand what was the purpose of fate in bringing us constantly together. I did not see her for quite a long while after my sojourn in Paris. And then one day when I came home from my office, I found her having tea with my wife and examining on her silk-hosed hand, with her wedding ring gleaming through, the texture of some stockings bought cheap in Tongenstrasse. Oh, once I was shown her photograph in a fashion magazine full of autumn leaves and gloves and wind-swept golf links. On a certain Christmas, she sent me a picture postcard with snow and stars. On a Riviera beach, she almost escaped my notice behind her dark glasses and terracotta tan. Another day, having dropped in on an ill-timed errand at the house of some strangers where a party was in progress, I saw her scarf and fur coat among alien scarecrows on a coat rack. In a bookshop, she nodded to me from a page of one of her husband's stories. A page referring to an episodic servant girl, but smuggling in Nina in spite of the author's intention. Her face, he wrote, was rather nature's snapshot than a meticulous portrait. This is a quote, so this is a parody. This is supposed to ridicule that style. So again, her face, he wrote, was rather nature's snapshot than a meticulous portrait, so that when tried to imagine it, all he could visualize were fleeting glimpses of disconnected features. The downy outline of a pommet in the sun, the amber-tinted brown darkness of quick eyes, lips shaped into a friendly smile which was always ready to change into an ardent kiss. This is a cliche bit of thing. So yes, these are the passages. I also have some excerpts from other stories that I've recorded. I'll keep them in the descriptions below. So yes, I'll be doing Joyce's Dubliners next.